asked its final thing of him, remember, and so Caleb knelt and spoke the names no one else would, names of men buried without markers, of promises broken under whiskey and greed, of families driven out and bones left to bleach, and with each name the night loosened its grip, the stars brightened, and the ground seemed to exhale, until at last the air warmed and the pressure lifted and Caleb felt lighter than he had since boyhood, knowing the price was not blood or fear but truth carried forward. And when dawn came it found him standing tall at the ravine's edge, alive, unafraid, and resolved, for he would become the town's quiet guardian, the man who warned travelers with steady eyes and a calm voice, "Don't look there," not because something waited to harm them, but because some truths must be approached with humility. And as years passed and the West moved on, Caleb's story became a legend told by firelight, of a rancher who stared into the darkest place and paid the price not with his life, but with the duty to remember, proof that the Wild West was never just about drawing fast or riding hard, but about listening when the land speaks, and honoring what it refuses to forget. Years later, when rail lines cut closer and the town swelled with strangers who laughed too loud and listened too little, Caleb Rourke remained where he had always been, weathered deeper by sun and silence, because staying had become his way of keeping faith with the land, and folks noticed how the cattle calmed when he rode past the ravine and how storms seemed to break around his ranch instead of over it, and though he never boasted or preached, travelers learned to heed the pause in his voice when he offered water and a warning, the same words delivered gently as a kindness, "Don't look there," and some scoffed while others felt the weight behind them and turned back. And on one autumn evening when a young gunslinger rode in chasing a dare and a name, Caleb walked with him to the edge, where the ground still bore the faint memory of fire, and instead of fear there was only a deep, steady quiet, and Caleb spoke then not of monsters or curses but of responsibility, of how the West is built not just by bold men but by those willing to carry what others abandon. And as the sun set the gunslinger lowered his eyes and tipped his hat, understanding without being told, and when winter finally came hard and heavy, Caleb fell ill and the town gathered close for the first time, listening as he asked only that the ravine be left alone and the names remembered. And when he passed at dawn the wind moved soft and respectful through the grass, and the ravine held its peace, and long after the ranch changed hands and the town's sign faded, people said the land learned to rest because one man chose to stay and listen. And that is how legends truly end, not with a gunshot or a scream, but with a promise kept long enough for the earth to forgive. The wind moved strangely that evening, the kind of wind that didn't cool the skin but crawled under it, whispering through dry grass and warped fence posts like it was carrying a message meant for only one man, and that man was Caleb Rourke, a rancher who had survived droughts, gunfights, stampedes, and betrayal without ever once feeling fear tighten his chest the way it did now as he stood at the edge of his land staring toward the ravine everyone in town refused to name, the place old men crossed themselves over and mothers pulled children away from, and it was there that he heard her voice again, low, urgent, almost broken. "Don't look there," she had said that morning, gripping his arm so hard her fingers left marks, her eyes wide with something worse than terror, something like knowing, and Caleb had laughed it off then because ranchers didn't fear shadows or stories, not when they'd buried friends and enemies under the same sun, but now the memory of her warning weighed heavier than a rifle as the sky bled orange and the cattle grew restless, refusing to graze. And that was when Caleb noticed it, the stillness, no birds, no insects, no sound except his own breathing, and against every instinct that had kept him alive for 40 hard years, his eyes drifted toward the ravine where the ground dipped unnaturally dark, and the moment he looked, his body locked, his breath vanished, and his heart slammed like a trapped animal because what stood there wasn't supposed to exist, not in daylight, not in this world, a shape too tall, too still, wearing the suggestion of a man but wrong in the way it held itself, like it was waiting to be remembered. And Caleb realized with a cold certainty that the stories weren't warnings, they were apologies from those who'd looked before and never come back. And as the wind finally screamed through the ravine, carrying with it the smell of iron and old smoke, Caleb Rourke understood that some parts of the West weren't meant to be conquered, and that the land sometimes stared back. Narrator pause. If you enjoy dark Wild West stories where mystery hides behind every horizon, make sure to subscribe now, because this story is only beginning. Chapter 2. What the Land Remembers. Caleb didn't know how long he stood frozen, staring at the thing that wore the outline of a man, but time felt wrong there, stretching thin like old leather, and when the shape finally moved, just a single step forward, the ground trembled softly, as if the land itself recoiled, snapping Caleb free from the spell long enough for him to stagger back, his mind racing through every sermon, every old tale whispered by firelight, every name scratched into forgotten gravestones, and suddenly he understood why the town had been built where it was and not an inch closer to that ravine, why no roads led through it, why even the outlaws avoided it, because the West remembered, and it remembered blood, betrayal, broken promises made when the frontier was young and crueler than any man alive. And as the shape began to speak, not with words but with memories that weren't his, Caleb saw the truth of the land laid bare, men who'd stolen, killed, and buried their sins in shallow graves, believing the earth would forget, and standing there shaking. Caleb knew the thing before him wasn't a monster born of darkness but of consequence, something fed by what men tried to hide, and when it finally raised its head fully into the dying light, Caleb did what no one else ever had. He didn't run, didn't shoot, didn't look away. He spoke, his voice breaking the silence like a confession, and the land listened, the wind slowed, the pressure lifted, and by dawn the ravine stood empty once more, leaving behind only scorched grass and a rancher forever changed, a man who would spend the rest of his life warning others not out of fear, but respect, because the Wild West wasn't just a place of guns and grit, it was a place where the past never stayed buried, and some sights, once seen, demanded a price that could only be paid by the brave enough to face them. Be why the third night after the ravine fell silent, Caleb Rourke understood that surviving the gaze of the land did not mean escaping it, because the West has a way of collecting its debts slowly, patiently, like dust settling on a windowsill, and as he rode fence under a moon thin as a blade, memories that weren't his pressed into his thoughts with the weight of truth, urging him back toward the ravine, not with menace but with necessity, and he realized then that what he had done, speaking instead of running, had bound him to something older than the town and deeper than the soil, a covenant of witness. And when the wind shifted and the cattle stilled again, Caleb dismounted and walked alone, boots crunching over scorched grass that still smelled faintly of smoke, until the darkness ahead breathed open and the ravine revealed itself not as a mouth but as a scar, and in that scar the land